So I was driving east on Fanshawe Park Road. Hey, I got it. Coming towards Hyde Park Road. That's what I was doing. And it's in the evening. I'm really thrown now. Anyways, I was coming down the road past Cops. Okay, that's where I was. I was coming down the road from Cops back towards London, and it's evening. And I noticed, well, how can you not miss? There is an enormously bright sign. That's the point of what I was trying to get at while I was driving. There's an enormously bright sign. It just cuts through all of the distractions in the night, and it's just so blaringly bright. You can't help but notice it. There's signs all around. There's signs everywhere. There's signs here, there's signs there, they're lit up, there's all sorts of advertisements because everybody's trying to catch your attention. Everybody wants you to notice that they've got a product that's available. They want to notice the things that are going on that they have available to you. Everybody is trying to get just a little piece of your attention. And we live in the distracted age. Sociologists say that the average young person has a time span that lasts for approximately 15 seconds. We're getting close to being like goldfish, which have an attention span of approximately 3 seconds. That in the age of TikTok, that YouTube is actually too long to watch a video. That YouTube videos, which typically have been on average 2.5 to 3.5 minutes. Now TikTok has filled in a void where you can get some information, some news, and you can just get that bite of information in a quick, fast way. We have smartphones in our pockets that buzz, and I, like anybody else, am too easily distracted by my phone. We're all sensing that we've got to stay up, that we've got to stay current, and some of you, even right now, are distracted by your phones. And that's just the reality of how distracted of an age we live in. We don't even think about how distracted we are, because it's become so normal to us that it is reportedly said that the average person can no longer read a long-formed article of 5,000 to 7,000 words. Because 5,000 to 7,000 words might take you 15 to 20 minutes. And most people don't have the attention span to see the development of an argument over that much time. That we have become a soundbite culture, and politicians have tapped into this knowledge and use it so that you don't actually know the substance of policies, but you just know the sound bites of the sayings. We're so distracted that we think nothing of turning on the evening news and watching stories that are entirely disconnected from one another. We watch one story about poverty, then another story about inflation, then a story about a fire in London, and we have no context as to how to put these stories together. They're just random smatterings of stories because that's how comfortable we are in an age of distraction. Neil Postman, in his book, this really prophetic insight that he had in the late 70s and early 80s, he said that we are amusing ourselves to death. That was the title of his book. And he could see that the day was coming where we would be so incredibly distracted that we wouldn't be able to think coherently, that we would be able to think in a way that puts pieces together. And the result of that is that we're so comfortable living in a distracted age that we don't even notice that we have beliefs and we hold beliefs that are entirely contradictory to one another. That's how distracted we are. We're so distracted that we're glad to live with contradictions in our lives, in our behaviors, in our beliefs. That there's no coherence, there's no understanding, we have no time to think. We choose not to think, as Neil Postman said, because we are amusing ourselves to death. That word amuse means not to think. We think that we're so distracted that we don't think, and that is killing us. And we even live in a world where we're so distracted that faith has just become one more tool that people use to form identity rather than understanding that faith actually is the counterintuitive piece in a distracted age that offers us not a life of contradiction, but a life of wholeness. Not a life of confusion, but of understanding. Not a life of cheapness, but of value. What Proverbs wants to do is it wants to cut through all of the noise in this distracted age. But it's going to require some work and effort. Anybody who wants to live the good life knows that you don't just slide into the good life, that the distracted age will actually kill your soul, but that giving attention to wisdom will bring you life and effort. So, how on earth do we live in a distracted age? I found this passage to be incredibly challenging for myself personally to think through. And 3 times we have wisdom calling out. And so from wisdom's 3 calls in chapter 1, verses 20 through 33, I want us to see 3 things then about how we ought to flourish in a distracted age. And the first thing, you're going to hear this over and over in Proverbs, the first thing that we hear is we hear wisdom's call. Verses 20 through 23, wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the markets, she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you be simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I'll pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. Here we have wisdom calling out. And she is described as a female because in the Hebrew language, nouns have either a male or female gender. And wisdom is a female gendered noun. And so wisdom is crying out. This woman is personified. Wisdom is personified as wisdom is personified as a woman crying out and speaking to those who would seek to hear. But did you notice that she's crying out in the midst of a ton of distraction? We see that in verse 20, that wisdom is crying aloud in the street. In the marketplaces, she raises her voice. Verse 21, at the head of the noisy streets. This is an age of distraction. There's a ton of noise going on. The TikTok is running, YouTube is going, the TV is blaring, the radio is on, kids are crying. There's all sorts of noise all around, and in the midst of that is wisdom's voice. Wisdom is crying out, and she is like a street preacher. And she's not any normal street preacher. She's got a bullhorn, and she is just getting her message out loudly as she can. She wants everyone to hear. She's trying to cut through all the noise. Like a bright sign on a night when there's lots of signs around, she is crying out. And specifically, we're told in verse 22, there's 3 types of people that she's crying out to. We're told in verse 22 that she's crying out to the simple ones, the scoffers, and fools. Those are the 3 people that are described in verse 22 to whom she's speaking. Simple ones, first. Second, scoffers or mockers. And the third one we see are fools. We need to understand each one of these groups in turn because they begin to help us to understand and be informed about how wisdom functions, how we hear wisdom's call. First, we hear of the simple person. The simple person, we could describe this as first maybe a spectrum of fools, okay? So there's a spectrum of folly that exists that begins with the simple and it ends with absolute fools. The simple are ignorant, they're gullible people. They'll believe anything and they are easily impressed. They're influenced by all sorts of voices. They can be easily swayed and persuaded. But what we need to understand is that just because someone is simple, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are unsophisticated. So often we have this idea that simple people aren't cultured people, that a cultured person is actually a very dignified and profound person. But Proverbs actually makes it clear as you go through the book that you can be an incredibly cultured and incredibly sophisticated person and still be simple. Because simplicity doesn't have to do with being cultured or having fine arts or having expensive tastes. What simplicity has to do with in the book of Proverbs really is this sense that you're easily persuaded by whatever voice comes along. We live in a day and age where lots of people are simple. They hear the messages on TV, they hear the messages of politicians, they hear the messages of musicians and artists and the cultural influencers, and they think that those are the voices that should be followed. They don't even question them. They don't question them because there's a cultural normative, there's a cultural narrative that everybody just seems to go along with. And there's so many people who function then in this category of simplicity, and it doesn't matter. You can be wealthy or you can be poor, and you can still be simple. One of the wisest people that I've ever known in my life was a man who only had a grade 8 education, who completed grade 8. It was my grandfather. He was a plain man. He was plain spoken. He started off working in the mill yard where he had to deal with lumber that was there. He worked his way up through the ranks, and he made himself work hard to learn and understand computers as they came in. And he got to a position in life where he actually did quite well for himself. But what made him wise was not that he was so skilled in understanding computers or seeing where things were going with paper mills, but what made him so wise was that he just had this common sense about him. I miss him dearly. He's been gone for about 2.5 years. One of the things that struck me when we were celebrating his life at his funeral was how my aunt spoke of how he just was able to cut through the riffraff in people's lives, especially as it related to financial matters. He just had a simplicity about him that could see through, and this is a good simplicity here, he could see through the folly of how people would spend more than they would make. He would help people to try and get their financial picture back on track. He would pour into their lives and spend time with them to help them. And because he was a man who lived by principle, because he was a man who had grown up, even though he had grown up poor, even though he had come from Newfoundland in a rural island fishing village, even though he had come from nothing, he had worked hard his whole life to know the glory of wisdom, to know the glory of the truths of Scripture. And he had a way of speaking that was so clear. Simplicity, you see, isn't the person who looks to us like they're simple, uncultured, or maybe not as educated as we are. The simple is the person who is easily distracted by the loudest voice that gets their attention. Whether it's TikTok or YouTube, or the nightly news anchor, or the rapper, or whoever it is, the simple is easily swayed. The second voice that wisdom cries out to, or the second person that wisdom cries out to is the mocker or the scoffer. You see that in verse 22, that the simple ones will just love being simple, and the next phrase there is, how long will scoffers delight in their scoffing? Here what we have is a person who we're told that they just delight. They absolutely delight in mocking whatever comes along. They don't care about the argument and how legitimate the argument is. They just care to destroy it by satire. They just make fun of everything. There's a place for satire and there's a place for being skewered by satire. I get that. But the mocker is the kind of person who, as Proverbs 1:7 said, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is the person who despises what God has said. They make fun of what God has said. And you can find this all over the internet, people who will make fun of Christian beliefs. They skewer Christians because it's just stupid, without giving any serious thought or without any intellectual consideration. Things are just hand-waved away. This is what a scoffer does. They're self-righteous. They kind of stand above everybody else and think that they know. And the third group that we're told in verse 22 is the fool. The fool is the person who hates knowledge. They are right in their own eyes. They have decided that they are going to do their agenda no matter what comes their way. They don't care about the facts. They simply care about being right. And wisdom is crying out, she says. She is screaming at the top of her lungs, trying to cut through the noise and make it clear That there is a path of life that she is offering. Verse 23. If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. And here what wisdom does is precisely what God does. Do you see that? Two things that God does, that wisdom also does. That when we turn from our own ways, when we stop thinking that we are wise in our own eyes, and when we turn to God, He promises us two things. First, I'll pour out my spirit upon you, which is precisely what wisdom says here. I'll give you my spirit so that you have the spirit of wisdom within you. And the second thing that wisdom says is precisely what God does. I will make my words known to you, which is what Jesus says. I've made known to you the words, the paths of life. And so this offer of wisdom is essentially the offer of God Himself. That God is offering Himself out to all who would hear. Listen, holding out arms, saying, listen to me, come to me. And so wisdom has a call. Will you hear that call? Will you respond? But there's a warning that I want us to pick up in verses 24 through 27. And the warning is that we need to be aware of not rejecting wisdom's call. Listen to what wisdom says in verse 24. Because I have called, there's that word again, I've called, and you refuse to listen. I've stretched out my hand, and no one has heeded. Because you have ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I'll mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Here is what happens if you reject wisdom. It's just plain and simple. Very clear. Calamity and disaster are coming your way. Calamity and disaster are coming. Just like the gang that we saw last week in chapter 1, the gang sets a trap and they're trying to trap people. The trap that they set for others actually becomes the trap that they fall into and are caught by. Just like a bird who thinks, I'll never get caught in the net, so the gang puts out a net and they find that they're caught. But wisdom here, it's screaming out and it says, listen to me, but if you don't listen, if you reject wisdom's counsel, if you say, I think I know better, I don't need God. The fool says in his heart, there is no God, as the psalmist will say. What happens when calamity and disaster comes? What does wisdom do? You see it in verse 26. This isn't pretty. Wisdom laughs. Now, I don't know about you, but I was taught that you don't laugh at someone when they fall into calamity. When someone has disaster that falls upon them, you don't make fun of them. So we've got to try to understand here what on earth is going on. Why is it that wisdom is laughing? Why does wisdom laugh at human folly? First, wisdom is not laughing at someone's difficult circumstances. Wisdom is not laughing at someone because hardship has fallen upon them. Wisdom laughs because wisdom goes, I was offering you the path of life and you totally missed it. I was offering you the better way and you thought that you knew better, and look at you now. That you scorned this. That what wisdom does is it laughs at human folly. And what we need to understand is that when hardship comes, that will be the test of what you have for real wisdom. We have to be tested in life because we all think that we're right in our own eyes. But as Proverbs repeatedly says, there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. Proverbs 14:12, Proverbs 16:25. Twice it says this, that there's a path that looks right. There's a path that looks like life. If there's ever been a culture that displayed that it thought that it could live without God, I'd say that it was probably the Soviet era mindset. In my time in Russia back in 2013, I think it was, one of the things that struck me was a country that thought that it could live apart from the wisdom of God. It looked all spectacular when you were in Moscow. As you drove down the magnificent streets, it made you feel tiny and small. But you got outside of that grandeur of that one street, and suddenly everything didn't look so great. To drive on, to be on a train and to look out and to see homes flooded and their potato fields flooded, and that's how people were living. That many Russians live, just trying to survive day by day. Regina Spektor, who was a Russian-American-born singer, songwriter, and pianist, she left Russia during the early days of perestroika, when the Soviet Union was beginning to open up. And she moved to New York at the age of 9. She and her family moved to New York City. And as she lived in New York City, she had to leave her piano behind in Russia when she came to the United States. But she picked up her music, her practice, and her love of music, and she began to embrace this anti-folk music that was going on in the day and age. And at first, having at first seen how terrible life is by living apart from God, she began to write and she began to reflect about the horrors of living a life without God, what it looked like. And so in her song, Laughing With, which was picked up both in two places, one was by BBC for a documentary that they produced, she sang these words: "No one laughs at God in a hospital. No one laughs at God in war. No one's laughing at God when they're starving or freezing or poor. No one laughs at God when the doctor calls after some routine tests. No one's laughing at God when it's gotten real late and their kid's not back from the party yet. No one laughs at God when their airplane starts to uncontrollably shake. No one's laughing at God when they see the one they love hand in hand with someone else and hope they're mistaken. No one laughs at God when the cops knock on their door and say, 'We've got some bad news, sir.' No one's laughing at God when there's a famine or fire or flood. No one laughs at God on the day they realize that the last sight they'll ever see is a pair of hateful eyes. No one's laughing at God when they're saying their goodbyes." Proverbs 1:27 says there's a storm that's coming. Everybody is going to face a storm. It might be a health crisis. It might be a cultural moment of economic collapse. It might be the loss of a job or the death of a loved one. I don't know what that storm is, but a storm is coming, Proverbs 1:27 says. Terror is going to strike you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind. And when distress and anguish come upon you, there's a storm coming. And when a storm comes, how much is TikTok going to comfort you? How much is scrolling through Instagram going to satisfy you when the storm comes? Who's going to carry you through? We can amuse ourselves to death and we can distract ourselves, but when the storm comes, guess what? You can't distract yourself forever. Wisdom laughs because you need more than distraction. Distraction will never save you. And so we have to beware of rejecting wisdom's call, because when we reject wisdom's call, what happens is we are left in a position where we have nothing, no comfort, no help, no peace, only a storm. And wisdom says, there's only so long. Which is why the last thing that we hear from wisdom in verses 28 through 33 is that you don't wait for wisdom's call. Wisdom says in verse 28 that when the day of calamity comes, it might be too late. It might actually be too late to get wisdom when you actually need it. And that you could find yourself in a position where you're in absolute ruin because you lived the life of a simple one or a mocker or a fool. Verse 28, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they won't find me. Why is that? Because you can spend your whole life being distracted by all the other voices. And then one day you discover that there's a hardship that comes. You're in a hospital room. You are devastated by the loss of your job. That you have had some sort of tragedy. And you can try to scroll through and find enough videos to distract you. But guess what? It will never take away the pain. Never. Verse 29 says, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, they would have none of my counsel and despised all my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. After a while, wisdom doesn't answer. Because it takes a lifetime of pursuing wisdom to actually get it. That you don't wake up one morning and just poof, magically download wisdom like a new operating system on your computer. It just doesn't work that way. That wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord, as I defined it, is this turning away from my wisdom and trusting in God's wisdom. It begins by understanding that God doesn't play games. God's not fooling around. That the way that we actually begin to grasp wisdom and to get knowledge, this practical way to live skillfully, Paul describes it in 1 Corinthians 3. He says that the way that we begin this download of wisdom, 1 Corinthians 3, verse 18, let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. And what Paul means here in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 18, is that the way that we begin on the path of life and the path of joy and the path of wisdom is by admitting you're a fool. This is the entryway into the Christian life. It's always been the entryway into the Christian life. The entryway into the Christian life is never that you've done enough good. It's starting by admitting that you're a fool, that you think that you know better than God. It's called repentance. That God isn't looking for good people. He's looking for people who can admit that they've lived as fools and that they need His wisdom. This is why Paul can say in 1 Corinthians 3 that what it begins with is not a deceiving of yourself and thinking that you are wise, but that you become a fool. You acknowledge your folly and see that when you acknowledge that you're a fool, you then can become wise. That's the pathway. That's the starting point. It's this scene in verse 33 back in Proverbs 1. Whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. That when the day of difficulty comes, yes, there's a storm coming and it's a brewing on the horizon, and a fool says, it won't affect me. But Jesus said in Matthew 7 that there were two types of people who built a house. That one man built his house, we're told in Matthew 7 verse 24, he built his house in a foolish way. And Jesus said, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. There is a storm that is coming, Jesus says, and the difference between being a fool and being wise is that the fool has thought that they are secure, but they have built their lives on sand. We were just recently, this summer, we were out in Prince Edward Island. And after Hurricane Fiona came through, we were just a 2-minute walk to the North Shore beaches. It was beautiful. Could walk, see the glorious dunes that are there. After Fiona came through just a couple weeks ago, it's probably taken the island back 50 years in terms of its development. The sand has just been blown and washed out to sea. Boardwalks are gone. It's all destroyed. Trees are lying down. And anything that was in its path and anything that was in its way is ruined. And Jesus says, whoever hears my words and doesn't do them, that's like building your house upon sand, that the storm will come and it'll wash you out to sea. But whoever hears my words, Jesus says, and acts upon them and is wise, that when the storm comes, it's not if, it's when the storm comes. That when the storm comes, that what you will find is that you have a secure dwelling. You see that in verse 33? Whoever listens to me will dwell secure, will be at ease without dread of disaster. What we have to do now is tune our hearts to sing God's praise. What we have to do now is that we have to see that wisdom takes time to develop. What we have to do now is hear the voice that's trying to cut through all of the other clutter, the voice that has the arms also outstretched saying, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Are we going to build our lives on the wisdom of this world, which is folly and sand? Or are we going to build it on a word that is secure, that God will put His Spirit in you so that you can be wise among wise? Because the wisdom from God is pleading. Come, listen. I'll give you a firm footing. I'll give you a firm grounding. I'll give it to you so that when the storms of life come, you don't look like you're being blown this way and that. That as a Christian, that you won't be blown by this doctrine and this trend and that trend, but rather that when all else is going on, when all hell gives way, that you can stand secure. That you can put your feet on the ground, you can know you're sure because the rock that is under you is the rock that is purchased for you by the Rock of Ages. That in a world of distraction, there was one who listened to one voice above all other voices. And that he faced the storm of the wrath of heaven. That when all of hell broke loose, that on that cross, when all hell broke loose, that there was not one budge in whom he would listen to, in whom he would trust. That he did not give way. That he did this. That he faced the wrath. That he faced the terrors of hell. That he faced all dread. That he was despised and rejected. So that in the age of distraction that you and I live, that his laser love focus would keep you in the day of calamity. That nothing would distract you from the very heart of God. And that's why he calls you in this distracted age. That's why his voice cries out. But the question is, will you hear him? Lord, we have asked and we have prayed this morning that you would speak, that we would hear your voice, that you have words of life. Those are the things that we've sung. And now your word says, "Come to me, all you who are weary. I'll give you rest." You give us the ability to dwell secure. Lord, in an age where we're distracted so easily. Oh, there's my phone buzzing. Excuse me, Lord. No. May we have one attention span, which is for you. that we would love you with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength. Lord, be our wisdom and our true word, that I would ever be with you and you would be with me, Lord. And that's our prayer. That's our need. We ask and pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.